Welcome to Filed, a monthly conversation with those at the convergence of data privacy, data security, data regulations, records, and data governance, or even AI governance these days. I'm Anthony Woodward, the CEO of RecordPoint, and with me today is my co-host, Kris Brown, our EVP of Partners, Evangelism, and Solution Engineering. How are you, Kris?
How are you? Good to hear from you again. Yeah, I think, I said it certainly this season we've spent a lot of time talking about AI, so probably time to stick it in the front there, I think, and start talking about it from the get-go.
I think the new intro coming, some work for us to do here on the Filed podcast. But today is another conversation about AI, I think.
Yeah, look, I think, again, we spent a lot of this season talking about AI and AI governance, as you just mentioned. Today, we're going to sort of take a little bit of a different perspective on, as the industry as a whole and talking about, someone talking to and talking about, the building tools and the building tools around the AI technology pieces. So today on the podcast, we've got Dave Slutzkin, a startup investor, consultant, founder, general raconteur. Welcome, Dave.
Hello, thank you. And good to meet both of you and great to be here.
Yeah, no, look, thank you. And I said, look, I'm going to get this out of the way early. The general raconteur, I have been accused of being an exaggerated storyteller, for the want of a better definition, but I really do like that. So I'm going to steal that one if you don't mind, Dave. Certainly for those who might be seeing some of the clips and other things, Dave, I do apologise that you're a suffering Arsenal supporter. This is the first recording of our podcast after Liverpool has gone on to win. So very, very much apologies there for Arsenal coming in second. Yeah,
I'm glad you had that ready to flick up as the virtual background. That's good to see.
I mixed all this. Did Liverpool win something?
Oh, please, as a suffering Arsenal supporter yourself, Please, let's not go there. It could be a very long podcast, and it's got nothing to do with AI. But again, I think the other interesting thing, Dave, and we've probably got a little bit more in common there outside of a love of EPL, is that, as I understand it, once upon a time, you did a little bit of a radio show, especially in the EDM space. So I said, I'm a suffering DJ myself from many years ago.
Yeah, back in the good old days, I did a show on community radio here in Melbourne, Australia, on a station called 3RRR, which actually the stone's throw from my house now. Fantastic community radio station. I did that for 7 or 8 years till the kids came along, and a lot of electronic music and EDM and a whole bunch of stuff. It was really fun. Radio is a fantastic medium. It still exists.
Yep.
It still has a place even in this, magical future that we currently inhabit.
Look, and I think, even from my service, it's certainly a suffering club DJ, is it, looking at the tools and things that they have access to now. There's AI-based tools looking to replace the DJ, but, it's still all about the vibe for me. I think the interesting thing is in that room, be it in a radio station or, in a booth, understanding what the people want to listen to and understanding how to make them, get up and dance or enjoy themselves. It's still that piece that I think is missing. Certainly, they can stick two songs together at the moment, but it's interesting watching all of those spaces.
It's interesting, and I, not to take this on too much of a tangent, but when we think about AI is theoretically going to replace filmmakers, and it's going to replace musicians, and it's going to replace DJs, But is that actually true, and is that what people want? There's something about knowing that there's a human mind which is crafting the experience for you in real time, whether it's as a DJ, whether it's as the musicians who are on stage, or in the case of a movie, whether it's been created by an auteur, maybe if it's a new Marvel movie, maybe it doesn't matter so much. But personally, I feel like that human touch is what comes through in great art or in a lot of art. And I don't know that AI is going to magically replace that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, just winding back a little bit, I do like that you use the word vibe today. I think it's very in tune with the concepts of vibe coding. But before we get into that and talk about some of those things, it'd be really great, Dave, to dive in a little bit and talk a little bit about your background. I know that, I was looking, before the podcast at some of the places you've been. I'm like, I think we have been shits passing in nights at different places we never actually met before. But I'm like, hold on, I was there and he was there. And you've been around a bit and done quite a bit, particularly here in Australia.
Not only that, I ran a company called SitePoint, and you're running a company called RecordPoint. So clearly we're basically siblings. I've been writing code for 35 years, since I had an Apple IIe originally that we got from my uncle a very long time ago, writing code professionally for 25 and running companies and startups for 15 plus. as CTO, but also as CEO or GM in various places. So I've been lucky to bounce around a whole lot of things. I fell into startups in about 2008, 2009, when certainly in Australia that barely existed as an industry at the time. I was lucky to meet the right people and got to go in and run some things and learn a whole lot and do half an MBA around the same time. So, and I've been lucky to invest in a bunch of things and meet a whole lot of really interesting founders and be in a position to start a few things myself over the years, including Cadence, which we might talk about a little bit later. Although we don't have to, I'm happy to talk about whatever makes the most sense here. But yeah, I've been really lucky to, I was into computers when I was, 12 years old, and it turns out that computers were going to be the story of the next 35 years. Who would have guessed? Whether they'll be the story of the next 35, whether you get to actually program, is a whole other question.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I think certainly you've had an opportunity to build a bunch of cool things. As you said, you've been involved in that space. You're now a little bit more focused on AI, and we will dive in a little bit to Cadence. But what was the turning point? I'm kind of interested in just looking at some of the things that you have done in the background. What made you decide to focus in this area around AI? There's obviously the gold rush, and we can all go, yeah, we're all racing out to make sure that we're a part of this. RecordPoint themselves have sort of been playing in this space for quite some time as well. What convinced you that it was worthwhile joining or being a part of this?
Basically, the problem that I and my co-founders wanted to solve is something that we had looked at on and off for 6 or 8 or 10 years, but now it's possible to solve it. That's the main reason. The secondary reason is I'm always very interested in where the world's going. And I would be and have been looking very closely at AI, researching, trialing, testing, trying to work out what I think what's going to happen to the world, partly because I've got an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old and I want to know what world I'm bringing them into. But also I'm very curious. I tend to like to understand where I think things are going. So I've been deep in AI for various reasons, personal reasons, just for curiosity and interest for years now. But also, as I said before, and we'll talk about Cadence, the problem that we're trying to solve is one of organizational communication, especially one in software engineering or dev or product teams, making sure that the right information goes to the right people at the right time. That's been very hard historically. You have platforms like Jira or Slack or whatever, which put kind of band-aids over communication, especially in a remote world, which is where just about every company is as of the last 5 years. But now with AI, we think it's possible to really help communication as opposed to just band-aiding the way that people have historically done it. So yeah, it's basically the technology is now at a point where we can solve a problem that we've all experienced and looked at over many years now and wanted to solve. So it was very clear motivation for us to jump in and actually do it.
Yeah, look, I think the interesting thing there is it's sort of a very similar conversation how I came to be here at RecordPoint. As 20 odd years ago, we were looking at the traditional information governance model of you deploy something to a desktop, it connects into the authoring tool like a Word or an Excel or a PowerPoint. And certainly I think this audience will be very familiar with. And there's that add-in mentality. And at a time that I finish writing a document or sending an email, I should tag it and I should do this or that or the other. And while that was mildly successful in some organizations, it was wildly unsuccessful in many, many others. And as the technology has grown and obviously machine learning and then on into AI, that ability to be able to remove that problem of almost apathy around information governance was the piece. And so I think it's a very, very similar story to sort of our own as well. In that sense of we've been drawn to the technology stack because it's able to help us solve problems. It's, we've been talking about these problems for a very, very long time. And certainly I think the first time I spoke about this problem with peers was, early dozens, possibly even late 90s. And it just wasn't possible. There was lots of other tools. There was workflows that were built. There was prompts that were built. There was all sorts of things that were built to try and help you to do the next, UIs that were built, make it easier, make it simpler, make it faster. To remove the problem altogether is, again, another level of problem solving. And I think we're at a very unique inflection point from a technology perspective because we've got these tools now, that agentic style AI that can do things for us is very, very interesting.
And you're right. I think the user experience fundamentally matters. And I think that's what we start to unlock with these tools. It's not that AI is necessarily magical. In some spaces, it might look like it. But if it unlocks certain user experiences that were not previously possible, that's what matters, especially in the field of whether it's governance or these sort of policy, these sort of fields where people should do things. But the problem with should is that you have to make it easy for them. Otherwise, they won't. Do it, they'll do a bad job of it.
Easy and show value, right? Like you could make it as easy as anything, but if I don't see any value in it, I won't do it either. So it's that, that the should comes with both of those. I think that's a really strong point.
Yeah, it's really interesting, hearing that background and the linkages there and that conversation about should. One thing I'd really like to understand is the problem you're solving with Cadence and really diving in more deeply, but probably even to come back a little bit in terms of the framing of the AI conversation. We on this technology side, we even on this data side are seeing this coming at such a speed, but that isn't a speed of the real world, right? It's not a speed that the average folk are going to cope with. You're sort of unpacking a little bit of what it looks like you're doing with Cadence. It looks like you're trying to solve some of that problem. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that is fair to some extent. What we're trying to solve in the short term, there's sort of two horizons for the way we think about this. In the short term, we want to solve problems for individuals, and then we grow out and we earn the right to start solving problems for organizations themselves. But only if we can solve problems for individuals, exactly what we were talking about before about the should. If I'm asking individuals to, in some way use a system that's going to give information to their manager or to the rest of the organization, there's a limit to how effective that's going to be if it doesn't feel like there's value for them. Exactly as you said before, Kris. There has to be value for the individual, or the individual has to see value. So what we're focusing on to start with is that challenge, especially in growing technology organizations where too much is happening. The thing that we hear frequently from individual contributors, from engineers or designers or product managers, is we have too many meetings and I still never know what's going on. They actually want to know what's happening in their organization, end up sitting in a whole bunch of meetings or reading a whole bunch of Slack channels or looking at a whole bunch of notifications, some of which are relevant to them, most of which aren't. So it's hard to get the signal from that noise. What we're trying to do in the very short term with Cadence is use AI to help the AI understand what the person is doing, and then the AI can help the person understand what is relevant to them of the noise or the undifferentiated notifications and messages that are happening throughout their organization. Give them a narrowcast, as opposed to a broadcast, a narrowcast understanding of what's going on in your organization and how it is relevant for you specifically. Which means that in first thing in the morning, ideally what we can show someone is here's 3 dot points of what matters to you from the rest of the organization in the last 24 hours. Here's 45 dot points of things that don't matter to you. Feel free to browse through them if you want, but we know what you care about. We know what you need to know about. We know what you're working on. Here's what actually matters to you right now. Here are decisions that other people have made that affect you. Here are changes to strategy that might affect you. Here's cultural things. Here's, communication that might affect you. But everything else, the fact that the marketing team just signed a new client, that's cool, that's interesting. You might want to be informed about that, but maybe it's not specifically relevant to your role right this second. What we see in a lot of people is that they feel the need to stay across 30 or 40 or 50 Slack channels and a whole lot of GitHub notifications and a whole lot of Jira notifications and a bunch of other things. And that's actually quite hard in practice. So periodically they declare bankruptcy on that and just ignore everything. And the rest of the time it just gradually builds up and up until such time as they do that. I hope that makes some sense, because then later on we try to solve problems for the organizations. But as I say, we have to solve the problems for the individuals first. Exactly what you said, Kris.
So let me posit this, Dave. So ultimately I then see that you're freeing up time of the developer, the team member in an organization like that, hopefully with the goal of increased productivity, which is a solve up the chain for your organization. Using AI is very important there, but I look at poor examples that are similar, which is, my feed on Insta or TikTok or Facebook, where it's like for months there, I got nothing but dolphin videos, and I'm not entirely sure why. What are the guardrails there that you're thinking about from a productivity perspective? Is this part of the problem that you're trying to solve of what is relevant?
We have to be really close to you. We have to be really close to the individual contributor or the line manager or whoever it is to understand what they're working on, therefore what is relevant to them at any given time. Yeah. That's the guardrail, is that we keep them in the loop on what matters to them and what doesn't matter to them and what they're working on and what they're not working on and what they care about and what they don't care about. It's staying very close to the individual in various ways. I won't necessarily go into detail about the specifics of the product right now. We're in very early testing. We're testing with a few trusted people, and we're not launching publicly quite yet. But what we feel like we can do is get really close to the individuals. Again, there's something that AI enables. Get really close to the individuals, understand what they care about, maybe dolphins are something they care about right now, but maybe not. Maybe we need to give them the feedback channel to say to us, actually, it's enough dolphins. Tell me about this other thing instead.
Very difficult. You've got to scroll quickly, just so we're clear. You've really got to scroll quickly. If it looks like a dolphin video, don't pause.
You can't pause, otherwise TikTok gets too excited. But maybe it knew that you needed dolphins at that time in your life, and maybe that's what got you to here.
Possibly. I might have to talk to my psych about that.
So it'd be good to drill in. I think, exploring that slightly more deeply, there are, I get the point of curating the conversation. I get your point of being able to bring in and out. But one of the issues we're really seeing as we talk about AI, and certainly from this kind of data governance data view, right, is that you are bringing through levels of abstraction that, effectively are interpreting things that are occurring in the organization. And so we've seen some examples of this ourselves, and I'd be really interested about how you're trying to tackle it, where as you bubble up change requests, as you bubble up, pull requests from GitHub or other pieces of communication, the tooling we have today isn't building agentic capabilities that are truly personalized and tuned to you. And I know that's sort of what you're focused on, but the LLMs themselves don't get there. And so what you actually get is an atrophy of the data coming through and the way that's being summarized to the point where it's a level of, 1984 groupthink. How are you thinking about tackling that issue? Because it's bubbling through the industry as a big one, as in all the conversations I'm having.
Problem at the moment is that AI is so transactional, and all the big model companies are working on giving it memory in various ways and trying to help it understand a little more, but that's proving to be hard. There are limited context windows. When I think about the specifics of the way that it works technically, we're up to broadly million token context windows, but that's not actually a million tokens because it has to do selective attention across those windows. So there's actually a limit to how much it can know in any given situation, which is a challenge for any model. You can train a whole new model on your personal organizational data, but that's not something that anyone is doing yet. That will happen at some point in the next 5 or 6, 10 years. The challenge is having enough of that context to understand what actually matters in a given situation. Otherwise you end up with, as you said, Anthony, you end up with this almost a downward spiral of, it's not quite garbage in, garbage out, but it's information that gets gradually attenuated each time it's used and falls further and further each time it's used to the point where it's not actually super useful anymore and potentially damaging at some point. Mm-hmm. What we're trying to do, what we believe we have to do to be effective at this, is we have to have a canonical data store which is actually correct, and which we know is correct, and which we put a human in the loop whenever anything goes into that canonical data store. So we engage with each of the individual contributors. It's another reason we have to engage with individual contributors. We have the concept of certainty built fundamentally into our system. How certain is the LLM about this particular thing? If we're talking to you, Anthony, in some context, and you say something about Kris, and we don't know what Kris's role actually is, we need to ask you the question so that we can understand that. We then put the data into a data store, which is our canonical data store, which is some sort of structured data store, whether it's an RDBMS or something similar. We put it into a structured data store, and then that data is, I'm going to say, correct, at least as correct as we can make it, and we have some concept of certainty around which bits of those are particularly correct. The smarts that we then provide are deciding which bits of that context are important for any given use case of the AI, use case of the LLM. Because we know that we can't throw it all into a context window. It's just too big. It's not only too big, slightly too big, it's too big by multiple orders of magnitude. You have trillions or tens of trillions or hundreds of trillions of tokens that would, when you fully understand organizational context, that would have to go in to understand this stuff. All your GitHub pull requests from the last 5 years, and all your Jira tickets from the last 10 years, and all your Slack messages from the last decade, whatever that might be. It's just too much context. And the foundation models, the models themselves won't be able to magically cope with that context anytime soon. So our value add is we have that canonical data store, we pull the data out, we help individuals put data into that canonical data store so that we actually understand. And we have a taxonomy that we put over that so that we know broadly what's happening in a technology organization, and put it in there, and then we funnel that into the LLM at each stage. But what we're not doing is using the output of that LLM to go back in without a human in the loop first. Right. So what we hope that leads to is that our data is continually, at least not getting worse, and hopefully continually improving in accuracy and correctness. So then we can base our conclusions on something that's actually accurate. as opposed to something that is garbage in, garbage out.
So the example being that Kris likes dolphins and Liverpool, so therefore he likes swimming in the River Mersey. Like that's the logical conclusion.
It's an obvious conclusion, isn't it? Do they have dolphins in Liverpool these days? Maybe not so much.
Maybe a porpoise or two. I don't think there's any dolphins.
Maybe an otter.
Yeah, probably.
And so like, I guess the question then comes, we haven't brought up, and I made the joke about it earlier, sort of the notion of vibe coding and bringing some of these concepts together. How do you see that? Because it's not just a fundamental shift in how we're communicating, which is one element, of being able to be more, integrated into your teams and your organization and the department and letting AI feed you more effectively. And let's be frank, we had elements of this that might have had greater human curation in times gone by. I worked many years ago on some really awesome RSS feeds that were really built for big organizations. And yeah, they were human curated, but they were really, the RSS was designed and the atomic structure we created was targeting down to a developer to go, what do you need to know when you log in this morning? So these aren't new concepts, but it's awesome that we're doing that. Where does that take us when we talk really about the productivity gains rather than just the team cohesion gains?
That's a good question. Vibe coding is something that I'm going to take the broad, let's define it first. I'm going to take the broad definition of vibe coding, which is coding using AI coding assistance. In some ways, they might be agentic, they might be AI enhanced CLIs, they might be AI enhanced IDEs. And then which one is cool? When we're recording this, it turns out that Claude Code is the cool one, but if we don't release this for 2 weeks, something else will be cool by the time the podcast is released. Vibe coding, we use a lot internally. We use those AI coding tools and AI coding assistants a huge amount internally, and a lot of the startups that I advise and work with and have invested in are doing similar. There are definitely productivity gains to be had here, but they aren't free. To some extent they were, right? Like Copilot, when it was first released a few years ago, it was just some nice autocomplete. That was essentially a free productivity gain. It wasn't a huge productivity gain, but it'll gain you, 5 to 25%, depending on what sort of task you were working on, how boilerplate it was, and a bunch of those things. That stuff was broadly free. But the next generation of them, which is more what I think of as vibe coding, haven't turned out to be free because you actually have to change the way you're thinking about coding. Some of us, I've been coding for 35 years. Those of us who've been in that position are fairly stuck in our ways. We have particular ways that we know that we interact with the system, we interact with the compiler or the interpreter or the IDE or whatever it is, particular ways that we debug, particular ways that we do things. But with vibe coding, that is kind of different. You don't usually start out coding. You usually actually write a lot more documentation than you would have in the past because you need to write documentation to guide the LLM. That's not something that every developer immediately clicks with when they first start doing it. I've seen quite a few people go on this journey and get there eventually, but not be there for the first day and the first week and potentially even the first few weeks of trying to code using AI coding assistance substantively. It's not as easy as it looks like it should be, or it's not. Maybe that's not true. It's not as easy as the hype would suggest that it should be. Because everyone's saying, "Oh, this is amazing what I can do." Partly that is true. It is amazing what you can do if you're building simple things, if you're building prototypes or, websites from greenfield or these sort of things. But if you're working on existing code, it's more complicated. I talked before about the context window. The same is true. I talked about it in the context of Cadence, but the same is true in the context of AI coding tools. You can't put your whole code base into one context window. It's too big. It doesn't fit. So you can't give the LLM all the context, which means that the coding tools themselves, whether it's Cursor or Claude Code or Roo Code or Klein or whatever it might be, what they have to do is try and work out what to put into the context window. And your job as a developer turns out to be, when you're writing documentation, to give them enough information so that they can understand what to go into the context window. So then when they write the code for you, it's approximately representative of what you wanted from that. If you don't do that, then you get crap. And when you get crap, the developer, when done naively, the developer thinks, oh, this thing's useless. It's not ever going to be useful, but that's because they didn't guide it effectively. It's very similar, in my mind, to when you're training a junior developer or you're trying to help someone develop in their career. It's quite possible to give them a task with no context and say, hey, go do this. And then they bring it back to you and you say, well, that was bad. You did a bad job of that task. But did they actually, or did you just not tell them enough? So I don't think necessarily the parallels between AI coding assistants and humans are necessarily useful, but they are potentially, or they're not accurate, but maybe they are broadly useful to think about this as a person, broadly defined, who needs context in order to do a good job. And your job partly is to give them enough context to do that. In the same way that it is if you're a manager, in the same way that it is if you're a senior developer working with a junior developer. So there are productivity gains to be had there. I don't think it's making people necessarily twice as fast on most enterprise software, especially if it's existing code. I don't think it's quite that level, but maybe it's 50 to 60 to 70% once people get good at it, once the organization gets good at it, and once the scaffolding is there and the structure is there. I think that's generally representative of what I've been seeing out there. So there's definitely some positives that come out of vibe coding, broadly defined. It's not a cure-all though, and it takes effort. And that's one thing I'm seeing with organizations, is that this is a new way of working. They have to put in the effort. And when the organization doesn't put in the effort, they don't see the benefit. And then they think it was a waste of time. Well, it was, because they didn't do enough to get over the hump.
Yeah, it's not that panacea, right? Like you're not just going to go, oh, well, we're going to go this way now and do the thing. You've got to put the effort in. I think probably there's an interesting correlation there between, RecordPoint, we're 15 plus years old and been doing things for a long time. That code base is very, very large. Building something net new, we probably would take an advantage from this and get productivity. And a startup choosing to go that direction might actually speed up some things. But again, as you say, you've still got to go, this is the direction we're headed. We're going to get good at developing this way. And that kind of leads to my question / more of a statement, Dave, and maybe I take a position and just sort of see where you're at. But, this is a net new industry. There's always going to be that ability to try and take advantage. Builder.ai is the recent thing for the audience. Ultimately, there was a tool based out of London. So, it's obviously very, very clearly being based out of London. It's supposed to be very important and well looked after and secure and trustworthy and all those things, but claiming that they were helping and building code using AI and being efficient. But it turns out it was 700 plus developers in the back end who give them a prompt, as you just said, the senior developer giving the junior developer the prompt, and then there'd be just a whole bunch of people pedaling in the background to pull this out. It does remove trust in this space. And do you think this adversely affects that AI journey, especially around the vibe coding and those, that got the, as you said, the hype? I think was a really interesting thing you said there, the hype of this is going to be so much better and faster and all the rest of it. And that's not necessarily as true or as cracked up as it's supposed to be. And then we have hits like this that come to the industry where it's like, this is just straight out. But probably the key here is, you think that there will be more of this, or, once bitten, twice shy in this industry?
Yeah. We know this is a hype cycle, right? We, at least those of us in this conversation, are probably old enough and grey-haired enough to have been through a couple of these now, and maybe this one's bigger. And I think there's probably more substance to this one than there ever was to blockchain and crypto, for instance. But it's still a hype cycle, so there's still going to be people who take advantage of that. There's still going to be people who read promises that don't necessarily exist, or that only implied. So one thing that I have seen in organizations that I've tried to help is that often what is happening is that execs, especially CEOs, are saying we should be more productive because of AI. We should be able to increase the span of control of our managers from 6 to 20 because of AI. Why? Well, just AI. You just sort of wave your hands a bit and say AI.
Spirit fingers.
And that is going to hurt. That's going to hurt a lot of, it's going to hurt the organizations themselves. It's going to hurt the industry. It's going to hurt the perception of what is possible, because no one quite knows. This reminds me actually of a period about 5 years ago, which some might remember, when there was some new illness that popped up in the world called COVID-19. And we had to engage in this process of collective sense making. Everyone was trying to work out, wait, what is actually happening, and how can I predict the future, and what is going to happen here, and what action should people take? It's actually relatively similar to that in some ways. Yeah, some stuff is going to be possible that wasn't previously possible with AI. No one quite knows what the bounds of that are. No one quite knows where this curve is going to plateau. It'll top off and plateau at some point. Is that already happening? Has it already happened? Will it happen next year? Will it happen in 10 years? No one quite knows that. So we're all having to engage in this process of collective sense making to try and understand what that is. And people arrive at different positions on that. Also, in a situation like that, there are people out there who will take advantage of that, to your point about Builder.ai, the people who will say, no, this is totally possible. You've read the hype. Now we are delivering on the hype. But are you actually delivering on the hype? Well, no, but enough people are going to believe that that's fine. So I think it's incumbent upon, especially CEOs and execs in bigger companies, that there's a lot of work for them to do to get across this stuff well enough. It also reminds me of the early days of cloud in, 20, whatever that was, 13, 14, 15, around that time. DevOps, Agile, all of these buzzwords that popped up in enterprise IT, where the CIO would read it in a magazine and say, we need to go to cloud, without really understanding that. I think the same is true of AI. It's hard, but it's incumbent upon them to get across this stuff and actually understand what's possible. But that requires having trusted people to talk to about it. And that's not easy to find in a hype cycle.
It is different this time, though. And I'm with you, blockchain, even to a lesser extent, some of the DevOps, it was just different ways of retooling things that are already done. Crypto, really wasn't impactful for the enterprise, and maybe its day is still to come, but seeming less likely. This is different because it's not the CIO when I'm having a conversation. It's not the CIO talking about it. It is the CEO. It is the operations people. It is the investor class who are saying there are, and maybe again they've gotten into the groupthink of the hype cycle, but they're saying this is revolutionary and different, and we want to lean in on what impacts are going to occur out of that. Now, I agree with you. I think a lot of them are still going to, brand of choice chat interface and say, hey, write me my wedding speech, and it's doing an amazing job of that and going, isn't this going to be cool? It's going to write every email for me. But also I sit here going, I don't write email anymore. I have a draft response to most emails that go in my inbox because I've set up a process that does that. And then I just curate that and send it back. So there is some confirming truths of those things if you lean into it in reality, right? So I would say it is different because it is visibly integrating into our daily lives. And I get it's not the entire population just yet. I get that no one's experiencing it, but I've never seen tooling like this that has had those profound impacts at that C level so quickly.
You might be able to tell I have nuanced views on AI. I'm not a booster, but I'm also not a doomsayer. I think there's a lot that's really positive about what will happen. I love the phrase, this time it's different, because we say it every time and it always turns out to be somewhat true and also somewhat not true. You're right. I mean, blockchain and crypto aside, which turned out to have very little substance. But I probably disagree with you on cloud. I think cloud did actually have some fundamental impacts on organizations.
That's a very Australian view, though.
Yeah.
I will hesitate. You look at the data of the hyperscalers' impact in Europe, maybe in the US it's a bit mixed, but you even go, and this is where I say it's different, right? And this is the data I'd present to my argument. The impact of what we're seeing with AI and agentic elements, and I know those are different things to unpack and it's probably not for this conversation. You look at the take-up of that in Europe, you look at the take-up of that in South America and the US, it is going faster than the take-up of the hyperscalers of cloud. That wasn't the Australian experience. Australia led the world, Australia, New Zealand really led the world in the take-up of cloud and the digital transformation and moving into those processes. I think one of the things that I've really observed, and I'm just coming off a 6-week trip around the US, is there is a different context going on. Those folk didn't lean into SaaS as quickly. They're having to do that because of AI, but their take-up of AI is so much faster than this country.
The interesting part about AI is because it's got this consumer side to it. As you said, it's writing the speech for your wedding or whatever that might be. Because it's got the consumer side, people can immediately touch and feel the power of it, which you couldn't do with DevOps, you couldn't do with cloud. You could potentially do it with crypto in some ways, because you'd buy Bitcoin and it'd go up and you'd think, oh, everything needs to be blockchain now, which probably led to extra hype there. But because this has this consumer side, I know many people who are not at all particularly tech-centric or tech-savvy, who are deep into ChatGPT and they use it for lots of stuff at work. Even whether or not it's sanctioned, they use it on their personal device if they need to, because the organization doesn't sanction it, but they know they have already seen how much effort's going to save them in their daily workflow. So I know a lot of people who use a lot of ChatGPT at work. It has that consumer side, it has that individual side. It doesn't need the whole organization to start using it in order for it to really have significant impact for you individually. And that's what that's what we're going for with Cadence. If no one else in the organization uses it, but you just use it, it should still have significant impact for you. So I think you're right. I think it is different from that perspective, that it's much more obvious and available, even for execs. So not only are they hearing the hype, but they can also feel it themselves, which makes them drive it.
We've kind of walked around a few things here. Putting a crystal ball on, where do you see this? Because this is the hard bit, right? I think this is the bit where we start to debate that difference to the others, because it could fizz out, right? One of the really big challenges I see with this technology in this conversation is it's a little bit like the experience you had with Uber, but on absolute steroids, in that Uber was unbelievably cheap. It was so much cheaper than getting a taxi, and now it's more expensive. Now it's more convenient. You use it. I still use it, but it's, it is. I certainly noticed the price rise. We're not really paying for AI today, right? Other people are subsidizing it. And when we come to recognize those costs, maybe the productivity gains or the future, it isn't all there. Where do you see that going? Because I think there are some really big icebergs to really still get through for this technology.
Completely agree. There's two graphs, right? Like there's the amount of cost that these companies are going to have to attempt to recoup from users, which is only going up and will continue to go up. VC cash or investor cash is going to get less available. That said, potentially not that much less available for a while, but at some point, that's going to be less available. The other curve that's coming down is the cost of actually delivering the service. We know that's going to keep coming down because that's what happens in computers. It's always happened. It'll continue to happen. What we don't know is where those two lines are going to meet and if they're going to meet soon enough. If ChatGPT Personal is costing you $2,000 a month, are you going to pay it? Probably not quite yet. Are people going to pay 200? People are already paying 200. So, okay, fine. The queries are costing still, even at 200 a month. It's fairly well documented, I think, that OpenAI is still losing money on ChatGPT at $200 a month, right? Less so in the AI coding stuff. Yes, they're still losing money per token on every request, but they are more aggressively attempting to recoup costs with per token pricing and a bunch of other stuff. And again, that's going to come up to meet it. The question is, can the value that's provided, slightly different curve there, can the value that's provided or the perceived value come up quickly enough to meet the costs dropping on the other side? And I think that probably does happen, but it's guesswork at this point. My gut feel in looking closely at this for a while, and especially in the last 6 months, looking very closely at it, is that probably the model performance itself of the current architectures of transformers, the transformer-based LLMs, that's probably topping out. We're probably at the point where we've seen all of the really big gains from that. There's a huge amount of money going into researching further that direction, but also researching other architectures. That maybe next week, maybe next month, maybe next year, but we can't know. And I don't think anyone in the industry even particularly knows. They're boosting it because, everyone knows what side their bread's buttered on. But I don't think we know what's going to happen in the future. I do think that it looks to me like transformer-based LLMs are about as powerful as they're going to get. They're going to get incrementally more powerful here, but not the same as the jump from GPT 2.5 to GPT 3 to GPT 3.5, which was huge. And Gemini 2.5 has been similar. A bunch of those things have been really big leaps. It's slowing down. So I think what that means is what companies are looking for now is ways to deploy this effectively so that they're getting significant value at the current cost, because they know that costs are going to go up. And if they don't know the costs are going to go up, they probably should know the costs are going to go up. And the other thing, maybe more nefariously, is that what the providers are doing is trying to get embedded enough so that even if they're not quite adding enough value, they'll be able to charge through the nose because they're already embedded in processes, embedded in organizations. The organization has restructured itself around using AI and LLMs in various contexts. So even if they wouldn't have made that choice originally, they now have to, because the organization's been restructured and you're not going to restructure the thing again straight away, even though it's now much more expensive. It's a really good question, Anthony. These things will move in some interesting directions over the next 6 or 12 or 18 months. I can put my futurist hat on and try and predict where this is going to end up. Probably the thing that I feel most confident about is that it has roughly plateaued currently. But We just don't know what might be around the corner. I suspect, though, the first time I built a neural network, which is what these are all based on, the first time I built a neural network was 2001. In my honours year of computer science, I built a recurrent neural network using what passed for memory back in those days. It took a long time for that stuff, 20 plus years, for that stuff to turn into something that was really transformative. It's quite possible that with a lot of money going into it, we'll find another transformative thing around the corner. But it's also possible it takes another 20 years.
It wasn't a neural network in its purest form, but in 1999, I built a recurrent neural network at university as well. So completely know what you're saying. And the reality is of the RNNs of those days, right? It's still exactly the same models that we're actually building in. That's slightly off the point. Quick rapid fire question then for you in terms of that future. Do you think we're going to be trapped? It sounds like you think we're going to be trapped even by the GPU rate and the rest of it. Because like one of the biggest issues of this whole conversation at an infrastructure level is there's really only one supplier. And that really caps the innovation. I mean, are those things that is that why you think we're plateaued? The innovation is being capped because...
I think NVIDIA being the one supplier. I mean, there are companies like Grok, not Elon's Grok, but the other Grok. There's a bunch of people who are also making chips, and I think that's gonna move pretty fast. So I'm sort of not worried about the one supplier thing. But I think my impression, and talking to people who know more about this than me, is that the chip stuff is still moving pretty fast. It's moving faster than Intel were in their heyday. It's moving fast. So it's not so much that that's plateaued. It's just that there's still any incremental benefits, incremental cost decreases available there.
Yes.
It's not that there's orders of magnitude cost decreases available from hardware, at least based on the current architecture again. So I don't think it's so much that the one supplier thing and whatever. I think it's more just that the architecture needs to do a lot of computation, and doing a lot of computation is still going to take, until quantum computers maybe change everything, doing a lot of computation is still going to take a lot of time.
Okay.
I want to bring us back to sort of just that adoption piece that you've spoken about. Let's talk about not the CEO this time, but the developer. Why would the developer refuse to do these things? Like I look at my own life. I said I'm a poor man's developer, having finished my software engineering degree. Again, we're all sort of the same vintage. I think one of the last episodes we recorded, Anthony very much changed my world, and that he's a bit of vibe coding and has built himself a bit of a process of making decisions around helping children choose food, on a day-to-day basis, which I think, genuinely we still need to take a good hard look at, Anthony. I think there's definitely a model there where we can subscribe that out. I'm already throwing a fist of cash at it. But, the vibe coding element, the use of AI, we understand, and I think we spoke about it just now, CEO very much seeing the benefit from a consumer side. I think Anthony used the example of the wedding speech, but even, in and of himself, using it for other tasks to eliminate things that don't make a lot of sense. But we spoke a little bit about that gap where it's the senior developer talking to the junior developer, the ability for the product manager to talk to the team. You're trying to solve that communication problem. Are there other governance problems here? Like, code quality, reliability, sure, trust of the system and doing it right, whatever else. But are there governance issues or security or legal risks that you think will be sort of baked into some of this that it's coming in? And where does regulation fall in here for, from where you're coming from?
I mean, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating question, regulation, because we know the government's always going to have trouble keeping completely up to speed with the cutting edge of technology in general. That's not an easy thing for governments to do. They get advice from, McKinsey or PwC or whoever it is, which may or may not be accurate. But also governance is going to be really important in this space, because there's going to be these non-technological implications of AI. If magic happens and it kills a whole bunch of jobs, that's a problem for governance, for governments generally. So there's a policy question there. Should we allow this to be used as a government or as a society more generally? We know the EU has gone a bit harder on regulating AI than the US has, and it seems, from my understanding, they're rolling that back a bit, because there's sort of only two positions you can take on it right now. There's no AI or lots of AI. There's not really a sensible middle ground, because it's too hard to specify what that sensible middle ground is in a way that people can understand. Wouldn't be surprised if the EU rolled back completely and went Wild West the same way the US has and just said, anything goes for a period.
I think the problem is that the technocrats in Brussels have gotten too technocratic. So it's not that the legislation is incorrect, it's that it doesn't talk about the actual human interactions. It tried to talk about the technology and what, not to try and debate you, but where we see it going, Kris and I have talked about this a bunch already, but is really it'll be more an evolution to what are the true human boundaries that sit around AI, rather than let's describe, what data goes in and what does bias mean and those things.
That's a really interesting point, and you guys are closer to this than I am, right? Like I have conversations with people who seem like they know what they're talking about, but you're obviously really close to this, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's hard to regulate technology generally for those reasons. You say, well, you're not allowed to have a neural network with more than 72 billion parameters. It's like, okay, what does that mean? Oh no, we have 71 billion parameters, but they're all multi-parameters.
This way, right?
Yeah, exactly.
As defined this way, so we're all good.
That's right.
And look, and I think the point to make here is that we're actually, in that space where I'm going to roll all the way back to the beginning of the recording. There's a human element to this. Do we want the element of art, of expertise, of, we can't, today we can't feed it the whole code base, but there's senior engineers in businesses that do understand how it all hangs together. That's why they're here. And we're not trying to replicate or remove. It's how do we add on to it? I think, the regulation piece here and probably the crux of the question, or maybe I'm answering it myself, is how do we ensure from a governance perspective we're getting value, that it makes sense, that we don't eliminate, we're not trying to put everybody out of jobs. That's not what we're trying to do. It's about productivity, value everybody's trying to create, bring it back up to that level of art. We've been automating jobs in manufacturing for a lot of years. That it didn't remove them; it just meant that there's other jobs these people will have to go on to. But what makes sense, and I think that's where the tough decisions for governments and governance is going to come.
I read someone saying the other day that the theory that this will automate away all white collar work is based in that standard kind of Silicon Valley tech viewpoint that every job is full of useless work. Every job is actually easy. It's just that people make it harder. Lawyers, that job's easy. It's just writing some stuff down. They always write the same stuff down. Why do they make it so hard and charge so much? Real estate agents, that job's easy. Accountants, that job's easy. The human elements of that. We've seen this over software. I've built a lot of software in the last 25 or 30 years. What you see with software is that writing the code is usually not the hard part. The hard part is working out what it should do and talking to the users to understand that, and talking to the users to understand their feedback and understand how you should situate that based on where they're coming from and what else you're hearing from other people. It's working with the other individuals in your organization to make sure you're pulling together the right viewpoints and the right understanding of that, so you're not biased in particular ways and a bunch of that. Like most of building great software is not going like this on a keyboard, and that's the stuff that's easiest to automate. But does that mean that it ends up, this is not manufacturing? It turns out it's not assembly line manufacturing. And I suspect the same is probably true of a lot of other white collar jobs that I am less familiar with. It's not as simple as task comes in, black box performs task, result goes out. It's actually more complicated than that. And that's why this stuff is probably not going to be super automatable. Now, what that means for regulation and governance, I don't know. It's a really good question. I don't think anyone has an answer. No one that I've spoken to has a great answer. Potentially you guys do, but a lot of organizations they're trying to work out at the very base level, they're trying to work out ROI on the spend, because yes, a lot of money is now going out towards OpenAI, towards Claude, or towards, Microsoft or whatever for these features. Are we actually getting ROI on that? Don't know. And then they need to work out, we're putting data into that shouldn't be going into it. And where's that data ending up? Is it ending up in servers in countries we don't want it to be? Or is it being used for training? Or is it, whatever other things? And they all give you a tick box to say, my data's not being used for training. But that's probably not actually the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is that your data is now going somewhere and you have no visibility of where it's ending up. I think there's a huge amount of really interesting questions that organizations are going to have to answer about that. Maybe people have great answers for it, but I haven't heard any yet personally.
To probably close out our conversation today, and it's been a really fascinating one. And it's something I used to say for years through the early 2000s, right? All automation is just the acceleration of a substandard set of business processes. And that's a lot of what we see, right? Because, you actually need humans to deal with the substandard element of those business processes. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I wish that we could really dive on, and definitely because of the forecasts, I'm going to make sure that Adam, who's the producer of this podcast, has you booked for a year's time so we can get you back and find out if that plateau's actually happened in AI and how real those things are. I think we all agreed, and probably to wrap today up with the really fascinating conversation, is that we probably all agreed there's still a lot that is unknown about what we're stepping into. There's a lot of excitement. There is a lot to actually prove there are observable elements of ROI, whether those are longer term returns versus short term returns is probably debatable. But there is something really here, and I think that's the super interesting piece of it.
Completely agree. And yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation. So thank you for inviting me on. Great to chat.
Thanks everybody for listening. I'm Anthony Woodward.
And I'm Kris Brown. We'll see you next time on Filed.